they pretended that I never asked, that they never agreed. So they kind of, yeah. So that's why I said, it's only half the truth when I said that I quit. I quit because I had no other choice, sort of. But I also quit because I was depressed. I was overweight. I was being ostracized. It was the most horrible thing that could have ever happened to me. And obviously, I had finished my master's degree, so no one of my previous mentors would kind of help. And so I kind of felt really, really alone.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Blooming Late Scientists. As you know, I'm always really excited about the guests, but today is a special one because I consider this person to be a friend, and it's so nice to have someone on that you really like. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Claudia Andretta, and you may have seen Claudia on LinkedIn. But Claudia, I'm going to let you do the introductions for yourself. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Martina. It is my pleasure and honor, really. And I do consider you a friend as well. So I was really pleased when you invited me on. Hi, everybody. I was really surprised when Martina invited me because, unlike many probably of the guests that have been on this podcast already, I do not have a PhD. I do consider myself a scientist, but I do not have a doctor in front of my name. And we'll dig into why that is, I guess, later during the podcast. Today, I'm a strategic advisor, and I work independently as a freelancer or a contractor, depending on the type of project. And I own Seek and Bio, which you may find also on LinkedIn. And that has been something that has kind of happened that I went into after a good decade in the biopharma life science industry. So after quitting academia a long time ago now.
So you specialize in a particular area at the moment, don't you? Could you talk more
Yeah.
about that?
So from a business perspective, my specialty is go-to-market strategy, and from a science perspective, it's everything pertaining to rare diseases, but specifically cell and gene therapy. But that's because of my industry experience. So I used to work as a global business development manager with the project management capacity as well, at one of the global companies for transfection reagents who do operate within the cell and gene therapy space. And so it was kind of how I accumulated a lot of experience in that field, both from a business perspective, but also from an operational perspective.
Do you know what? There's so much you said that I want to kind of dig into, but
Sure.
one of the things I guess is you said slightly earlier on that you said, I don't have letters after my name, but I am a scientist. And I think this is such an important thing today because we all do this. We all have this habit of thinking that a scientist has PhD after their name.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that after your name, you can't possibly be one. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, that's not true because, a PhD is 3-4 years of doing something. So for me, I spent my 3-4 years doing that. I spent a year in the lab for a drug discovery company, and then I was out of the lab. Now, take someone like you. You have spent years in the industry, longer than I
Yeah.
have. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
it makes absolute sense, doesn't it? That you're a scientist. The letters after your name are irrelevant.
I would think so. And let's get very historical about it. But if you think about where do science come from, where do the scientific methods come from, it's Galileo. If we want to go back to the scientific theory, and this is kind of how I think day in and day out. Even when I think about business and when I introduce myself and my business, I always say I'm a strategic advisor and I do business, but I do business informed by science. And that's where the value lies. It's not, everybody can draw, I mean everybody, but a lot of people can draw a SWOT analysis or, a pestle analysis or whatever. But there's few people who can actually do that in scientifically informed way, and I do consider myself able to do that. And that's because, well, I may not have a PhD, but I've spent years and years in academia. Nevertheless, I have two MSCs. So after leaving neuroscience, that's what I started out doing. I completed my master's degree in neuroscience, started out the PhD, but then we'll get into that. And then I moved into another MSc. So I did 2 more years of postgraduate training in sciences, and that was forensic science. So an entirely different area, but it's still sciences. And then industry work as well, where at least I considered important, and I was lucky enough to have um, a team around me that also considered it important to understand the scientific side of the things we were selling, because I started out as a sales rep in the industry, BD sales rep, and so to me it was really important to be able to understand the product themselves, why they were valuable, and especially because when you talked to other scientists, so on the other side of the phone, or where you met clients who were scientists themselves, it was kind of, yeah, to me it was the value in talking, in speaking the same language, basically. Science is just another language in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Because social media is the place where you see all sorts of disagreements and different opinions, and it's great for
Yeah.
the most part, right? Um, and there's always this battle, like, do you need to be a scientist to be in a particular role? So particularly in marketing, there's an argument that you don't need to be a scientist. Oh no, you do need to be
Mm.
a scientist. And I think the real answer is it just depends, because obviously if you're doing strategy very early on, you don't necessarily need the science, because
Yeah.
it's about building the business quickly. But if it's like content creation, science writing, creative, then sometimes it's quite helpful to have the background. But would you mind explaining, because I mean, I know our audience probably does, but you never know. Could you explain what go-to-market strategy means?
So go-to-market strategy is probably the most complex thing one could do, because it goes from mapping the market to putting a product on the market. And so let's say you're working in a corporate environment, as I used to do. So big company, you have big teams, and you want to launch a product, and that's usually from product development teams. They've developed the product, and the product management team wants to launch the product on the market, and then they need to understand where the market has to be placed, whether the product has to be placed on the market. Now, the company itself already has a market placement, sort of, whether it's a mid-range company, and that's true. I guess you've been in luxury, Martina, so I guess that's true in every industry, but it's just as true in the life science industry. And so if company A has a market placement which is mid-range, company B may have a higher market placement or a lower market placement. So it's important to remind themselves where they're at and where that particular product is going to be placed in their own market niche. So market landscaping, basically. And you do a market analysis, and a lot of corporate people outsource that. So they do market researchers. They ask people like McKinsey or
Yeah.
IQVIA, the big data people, and they order the market analysis, and then they sit down around the table and they kind of decide what their pricing is going to be, when the launch should happen. But that should be done. Those types of decisions should be done strategically. And so I do go to market strategy, but I don't do it myself. First of all, because I'm just one person, obviously. I kind of coordinate the go to market strategy and ask for more data if necessary. Sometimes they already come with the data, sometimes they don't. And so at that point, I kind of ask um, if the data is coming or not, or if we should just base ourselves on maybe past experiences, past launches. And then we start working on the pricing strategy, on the launch strategy, and then on the sales, on the commercial strategy, basically. There should be a supply chain type of side to go to market strategy as well. I have no experience myself in supply chain, except for working in multidisciplinary teams, but I've never had to handle supply chain, and I think it's a very, very specific branch of the business that needs its own people. So usually there should be someone in the room who handles supply chain, if that's necessary. But usually, when we talk supply chain, we talk operations, and strategy and operations are kind of two different sides of the business as well. But I do like to talk to the supply chain people before we set out on that particular go-to-market strategy. Hopefully that was clear enough and I didn't ramble too much.
Very clear, very clear. And actually, I mean, the first part you said, market landscape. I mean, we could talk about this all day, right? Because
Yeah,
how many companies don't do that? So
I
many.
know. I
It's
know.
scary. And then they try to reverse when everything's going wrong,
Yeah,
rather than kind of invest up front. I don't know if you had the same experience.
I did. Yeah, it happens a lot because they think they don't need to, because maybe they already have a similar product on the market and they're just sort of upgrading
Yes.
or putting on a market a product that's a little bit better or a little bit less good. And so, kind of tweak the pricing. But if you don't know who you're addressing, and, when we're talking about market landscaping, we're not only talking about um, the pricing and the market and whatever, and when to launch it. We're also talking about identifying your customers. And so I
Yeah.
see that all the time, companies launching products that don't have a market because there's no customers, or if you don't create that customer base first and kind of create that FOMO that we're so good at creating today with social media, but somehow life science companies have missed that. That they don't know how to do that. And so yeah, there should probably be something to learn there for them.
100%. I feel like it's business 101 and it's just
Yeah.
missed all of the time. It's so interesting watching these things unfold in front of your eyes and
Hmm.
thinking, this is not going to work. I mean, I feel like we could just have a natural episode just talking about that, but obviously we're here to talk about you. So let's go back, because obviously all of this started somewhere. So talk to me a little bit about, I don't know, high school and university and your journey there.
Yeah. So, well, I think probably the first thing that's important to say, and at least it is for me, is that I'm an eldest daughter of three. And I'm Italian. So, those two things put together mean that I sort of grew up um, with a specific place in this world, or at least a specific place in my family, that I had a lot of responsibility on me, that I had to set an example for my siblings. And so, university was always in the cards for me. Doing well during my studies was always something that was required of me. And so I went into undergrad with that in mind. And it was actually, my dad is an economist, turned financial guy. And for a long time, when I was a kid, it would say that I would sort of follow onto his footsteps. And so I remember that I was 13 by the time I decided that I wanted to do biology. And before I ever told my parents that I wanted to do biology, I think I was 17 or 18. So to me, there was that kind of pressure on me, um, that I didn't want to disappoint, but I also didn't want to do something that I knew I wouldn't enjoy. And so I kind of waited for a very long time and went through high school thinking, I might not enjoy this, because you don't do biology, you do basic science in middle school, and then when you get to high school, you actually dig deep into more of the physiology, anatomy, etc. And so when I started doing biology in high school, I was like, yeah, this is definitely what I want to do next. And it took almost all of my high school years before I was able to tell my peeps that I wanted to do that for my undergrad. And then, well, lucky enough, they were really happy that that's what I wanted to do. And to be completely sincere, even back then, the idea was that I wanted to be a researcher, that I wanted to cure disease, that I wanted to contribute to, finding cures for horrible diseases. And um, even then, it was neurodegeneration. And that's kind of what informed what I now deem to be probably the biggest, if not the biggest mistakes I made, but at least the biggest turning point in my life,
Mm.
still as of today. I'm 37 years old, and it's still probably the biggest turning point in my life. That so what happened is, well, I went through well, we now call undergrad, but it was a 4-year bachelor's degree back home in Napoli, in Naples, Italy, which I enjoyed immensely, even though there were highs and lows. I started very high, and then it kind of went a little bit down, and then I don't know how is it in the UK. I know certainly in France, that's where I live. um, the undergrad system is a little bit different, meaning that you have set dates for your exams. In Italy, you have a couple of dates every semester, but you manage your own schedule. So you kind of decide when you are taking exams. And so
Oh,
what happens is, yeah. So then that kind of has to make you grow up a little bit faster. But the downside to that is that if you don't take an exam on year one, for example, and you don't take it on semester two of year one, then you might end up with one of your first exams taken at the very last year, or once you're trying to finish your undergrad. And so that's what happened to me for, I believe, a couple of exams, and that was one of them was inorganic chemistry, if you can believe it.
oh no. Oh no.
And so I took that. I think that was one of the last exams I ever took during my undergrad. Before I discussed. So we also discussed a small thesis in Italy for your undergrad. So I had 3 months internship. I actually went on a retreat with my professor back then. It was the most fun I've ever had. And then wrote the thesis and presented in front of a jury. And then 2 days later, I was in France. 2 days later, I was in
Wow.
France. Yeah, because I was looking for a summer internship, so I discussed my undergrad thesis in July, and so July 20th and July 22nd, I was here in Strasbourg for an internship that didn't begin until August, really. And so that was my very first internship in a neuroscience lab. It was a neurochemistry lab where they studied the neurochemistry of circadian rhythms, so sleep-wake cycles, and in particular with the relationship to addictions. So they were kind of studying in rodents what happened when you gave addicting substances to small rodents, and how that affected their circadian rhythms. And so, yeah, the rest is history, basically. And the rest is that while I was there for this internship that should have been just that, I did two things. The first one was I came back and forth to Italy to apply to the Superior Normal School in Pisa, so which one of the biggest schools for postgraduate schools for the neuroscience program, because there was no neuroscience back in my hometown, or neurobiology. And then I applied to what I ended up doing, which is the Joint Master in Neuroscience here in Strasbourg, which was happening in Strasbourg, Basel, and Freiburg. So it was a trinational program, and it was an international program. So it was taught in English, and it was very selective. So it was just 18 people, among which I was accepted. And it was demanding, but it was extremely fun. And so that kind of will lead me into what happened next. But maybe you have questions before I go on.
I mean, it just sounds like you've done such a lot. And this for me was the point of this podcast, actually, was to talk to people who did PhDs later, but also people who didn't have things like that and had different experiences,
Yeah,
and to show that actually people have huge amounts of experience in their field, for
yeah,
years. And you've done all these different things and had such a diverse experience. But I guess, I mean, this is just for me, really. What interested you so much about neurodegeneration at that time?
So we're talking 2005, right? So this was 20 years ago almost.
Yeah,
So it was almost completely untapped territory. We knew there were these problems. We knew that to some extent we knew by what they were caused, but we also knew that we couldn't touch those particular brain regions or those particular DNA regions in terms of, when we're talking Huntington's disease or we're talking Duchenne, we're talking huge genetic mutations in regions that were really, really hard to touch. And again, 2005, 2007, my first human genetics class, we were just starting to talk about gene therapy and the potential of gene therapy, but there was no clinicals back then. We're talking 20 years ago again, and so no one was doing gene therapy in the clinic. And I remember my eyes going wide when I first heard about that, and also when we started talking about membrane potentials in physiology class, and I was like, yeah, I really want to do neuroscience. And it was the same eye-opening, mind-shattering moment that I had years before when I decided that I wanted to do biology. And I was like, yes, this is what I want to study next. And I don't know, it's just really exciting. And when I meet new people and they ask me, what did you do in uni? And I say neuroscience, and everybody says, oh, that's so interesting. I feel like neuroscience is so interesting, and it is. It's so exciting, and and I feel like we've barely scratching the surface even as of today. And I know there's famous podcast today talking neuroscience. Andrew Huberman,
yeah.
who doesn't know it, right? And he's kind of making neuroscience mainstream, but that's been going on for 2 years, and I've been in neuroscience for over 10 years now. And I say I've been into it even though I'm not a researcher, because I can't help myself but keep reading about it. It's just such an exciting field, and maybe someone else will feel the same way about another field of biology, but neuroscience, I mean,
It,
it's just so fascinating.
do you know what? It's funny because when I was at uni, I hated neuroscience.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even want to entertain the idea. I just didn't want to do it. But like you, I had that moment
Yeah.
where I found my niche. And it's going to sound so boring after what you just said, but mine was about parasites modulating immune systems. And I just was like, wow, this is insane. And then, I mean, very similar. I ended up following that route because I just loved it and was fascinated with it.
Mhm.
But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, with neuroscience, we are so far off from discovering everything that's possible. And
Yeah.
it is really exciting. Now I'm older, I think I can appreciate more of that.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's something, I mean, particularly things like subconscious. I mean, for me, that is just
Absolutely.
fascinating. Absolutely
Absolutely.
fascinating. I don't know if we'll ever be able to quite get to grips with that. Um, so let's go to the big part of the story,
Yeah.
because this is the part that I think is just going to be really helpful for people. If you're happy to talk about that,
Yeah. So I'll try to be quick about this and then get into how I got into the industry, because it's
yes,
how what's going to be more valuable for the listeners. But so what happened? You remember I said two things. The first one is that I wanted to do neurodegeneration, but the second thing I said is that I started doing that internship in the neurochemistry of circadian rhythms. And so throughout my first year in the neuroscience master's degree, I had to do 2 days a week of lab work. And so I stayed in that lab. I stayed in the lab for my internship. And I did a lot of stuff, work with animals, immunohistochemistry, immunocytochemistry. Um, I did behavioral work. I did feeding times, inverse circadian rhythms. We would keep the animals in the dark throughout 24 hours. I did things that honestly a first year grad student normally doesn't do. I was responsible
mm,
for a whole course of animals that I would have to go feed at 7 a.m. in the morning. and things that today I wouldn't be able to do because, life and you get old and whatever. But then, I was still young and I still had, let's say, dreams and ambitions. And so when the time came to do my lab work for the second year, which was 100% lab time, so I finished my exam on year one. And so instead of staying, I decided to move lab and go to another lab here in Strasbourg, which is still today one of the biggest, so one of the biggest institutes rather, where they do translational neuroscience, translational neurobiology, or at least that's what it's, that's what's written on the building. The truth is that's why I said this was probably the biggest pivotal moment in my life. And I went on because they were working on Huntington's disease. So Huntington's disease, for those who don't know, is a neurodegenerative disease which is caused by a repeat in a three nucleotide region in the Huntington protein. So it basically produces aggregates, a little bit like what happens with Alzheimer's, but
Mm.
and it's a relatively rare disease, meaning that the incidence is very high for a rare disease. And again, there's no cure as of today. There's a couple of clinical trials ongoing today, 2024. But yeah, still untapped. And so, remember, I said I wanted to do that. I wanted to cure neurodegenerative diseases. And so that's why I went into that lab. And it was the most toxic environment I've ever been into. I'll just say this. So, when I write about not doing a PhD on LinkedIn, it all sounds like it was a cognitive, a conscious decision. It sounds like it was something that I decided, but that's only half the truth. So the half truth is that I decided to quit at some point, when I was 1.5 years after finishing my neuroscience master's degree. But the other half of it is that they promised me a how is it called, a scholarship, so to basically give me a stipend. And I was kept on a student an undergrad student stipend, so that's 400 euros for you per month for an additional 6 months while I waited for a scholarship that never arrived. That when I said, look, I'm going to look for other positions, will you write the letters for me? They pretended that I never asked, that they never agreed. So they kind of, yeah. So that's why I said, it's only half the truth when I said that I quit. I quit because I had no other choice, sort of. But I also quit because I was depressed. I was overweight. I was being ostracized. It was the most horrible thing that could have ever happened to me. And obviously, I had finished my master's degree, so no one of my previous mentors would kind of help. And so I kind of felt really, really alone. So I quit, stayed home for a while, started studying for the forensic science master's degree, started applying for PhD programs for the year after. But, the waiting felt long. I had no recommendations. And that's how that's how it kind of happened. And at some point I decided, you know what, I'm just going to see how I can transition to the real world, meaning how I can find a job in the industry. What can I do? And I didn't know. I had no idea because I'd always been destined to one certain path, and not anything else. Nobody had ever told me, with your competences, with what you've learned, you can do this and this and that. I always been brought up thinking that all I could ever do was PhD, postdoc, research, whatever.
Yeah.
And then maybe professor, That's all I had ever known. So I had no idea, and I had no one to help me. No one. So one day when I started applying back and forth, I actually applied, to work as a lab technician for, those who do blood analysis, which is, probably a fantastic job. I have no idea, but I didn't have the diploma that goes with it, because you have to be a healthcare professional to do that. And I wasn't. I was a research professional. And so at some point I started obviously looking on LinkedIn, Indeed, or whatever were the websites back then, until one day a friend who is still a friend today, who was also Italian and during whom I met through actually a former lab colleague, reached out to me and said, I work at Merck Life Science. So it was Merck Millipore back then, 20 kilometers out of Strasbourg. We're looking for a technical service scientist who's a graduate biologist, speaks Italian, speaks French, speaks English, speaks Spanish. I don't, but it was not necessary.
Yeah.
Send me your CV. I'll pass it along to my manager, who's the hiring manager. And so they called me 1 week later, and I wasn't retained for the job because they were looking for someone who had experience in flow cytometry. I'd never done flow cytometry in
Right.
my entire life. Turns out they liked me because I had to do a presentation, so I had to kind of learn on the spot, both about flow cytometry because I had no idea what that was. I mean, kind of knew what that was. From an
Yeah.
operational perspective, I wouldn't be able to troubleshoot someone else. That's what I mean. And also learn about their own products, because why they wanted someone who was knowledgeable was because they had flow cytometers. And so they needed a technical support scientist who would be able to troubleshoot over the phone for a customer. And so they liked me so much that they kept my CV. And 2 days later, I was called for a new opening for an inside sales role, inside account manager role for the bioscience division. It was a new role in a new team, and I was, I believe, the youngest and the first one to be recruited into that job. And the rest is history.
Can I just, oh my God, I mean, there's just so much there. First of all, let me just say, I'm sorry that happened to you, because that's absolutely disgusting. I mean, clearly
I
you're a
know.
success anyway. You didn't need it.
Thank you.
But I'm so sorry that happened to you. That's absolutely atrocious behavior.
Yeah, and
Um,
I'm sure this is still happening. I hope not, but I'm sure it is.
mm,
And honestly, it's the most horrible thing because you feel like you're alone in the world. Like nobody's helping you. Nobody's reaching out. If even when you're reaching out to your former mentors, they're like, that's life, toughen up. And so probably one thing to say to the listeners today is, if this is happening to you, there are support systems, there are people out there, and there's a lot of people even on LinkedIn now doing the Lord's work for former
yeah.
PhDs or former master students who need to transition and get out of academia, basically.
Yeah, it is. I mean, sadly, we're not here to bash academia, but it is a toxic environment for many of us. I mean, I had not
Yeah,
that experience, but different toxicity.
yeah,
It's not a great environment at all. But when you moved from academia into this kind of inside sales role, what was that like for
yeah,
you? Because that's such a different experience, isn't it,
yeah.
work-wise?
It is. So I think I was lucky in the respect that it was a new team. So they decided to bring into the team. So it was a European team, and we were all in house, and each of us, I think we were 6 or 7 of us. Each of us had to take care of a geographic region, and obviously mine was Italy, Spain, and I think it was Switzerland as well. So not the German Switzerland, but there's an
Yeah,
Italian side to Switzerland. So, and so there was the person who would take care of France and Belgium, and a person who would take care of Germany and Austria, the person who would take care of Spain and Portugal, or Portugal plus another side of Spain. So it was kind of this 6, 7 people team, newly created. Inside sales teams already existed in the life science industry, but didn't exist within Merck Millipore. So it was, and I think I was lucky in that regards, because everything was new for them and everything was new for us. And there was me fresh out of uni, and there was another colleague of mine. She was 20 years into an account management job. She was from Life Technologies, now part of Thermo. So and it was the thing where, you know, the hiring manager, I believe it was up to him back then, chose to bring together a very diverse team. And so we kind of learned from one another because we spent a lot of time together. We were on the same open space office, but also we had, you know, weekly meetings. And I gotta say that first year into the job, I missed the bench so much. And my manager, so in the end, it wasn't a perfect manager, but I have to recognize in retrospect that, you know, he kind of was good at understanding cues from us. And when I said, "Oh, I missed the bench," it would organize days in the application labs. Those where we usually
Oh,
brought
how
the
lovely.
customers. So he would organize it for us to have us test the products and use them and understand how you know how you would handle those products. And it was the same products that we were trying to sell into customers. So it was so much easier for us to try and visualize that, because as an inside sales, you wouldn't go out and visit the customers and demo the progress. And the fact that we had the chance to touch them and use them made it so much easier for us to convey the value over the phone or over email. It was fantastic. And so and that also kind of satiated that hunger that I still had to be at the bench in the lab. You know, I know a lot of scientists say, I hated the bench. I love the bench. I love being at the bench doing, you know, pipetting and stuff. So,
Yeah.
and I really miss that. And I still found a way to incorporate that in my job. But per your question, I know I went in a little bit of a tangent, but
No,
per
this
your
is good.
question, I think obviously what I had that scientific side that they wanted to keep, because you know they felt like the value of selling scientific products uh, from a scientist perspective was important to keep. And I had the fact that I spoke multiple languages playing for me. Obviously, I had no business knowledge or experience, but I think they probably sort of saw that I was good at negotiating. I don't know where that came from. I always say it's probably genetic, because my mom, my dad, and also my grandpa before that were all more or less doing business in their, you know, in their days. And so I always say, yeah, it's a family trait. We're good at negotiating. And so I don't know if they saw that when they first interviewed me. Um, and then obviously I learned. I learned along the way. I was trained a lot. We were training consultative selling techniques right when we were all recruited, and then again after a few months. And then obviously we were trained to use the CRM, which is Salesforce.com, which I then became a specialist on years later, but that's another story.
Oh,
But yeah,
interesting.
so you know, I was lucky to have a lot of support from the management and from my team, and a lot of training. So you know, the company actually invested in people training, at least back then. I would hope it's still the case, but you know, never know.
It makes such a difference, doesn't it, when you've got a company that is
Yeah,
willing
it
to
does.
invest in your
100%.
development? I mean, that's how you keep people, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So thinking about, I mean, you know, there's so much experience here, as I said. How has each of these kind of led you to where you are now?
Um, I don't know. That's a good question. So, well, I guess the story is I stayed with Merck for 4 years overall, and that's the longest job I've ever kept. So I've worked for three more companies after that. And those were shorter term jobs. So I mean, I was always recruited for indefinitely amount of time, you know,
Yes.
indefinite contract or whatever it's called. But I never stayed very long. Um, for one reason or another. I'm not going to get into that, but I guess the decision came at some point when I was faced with too much poor management. And I was like, I'm over being managed by stupid people. And so when I saw that it was too hard for me to climb the ladder because I was still seen as too young. You know, I've always been seen as too young. I don't know why. Even when I hit 30, 35, I
So
was still seen as too
ridiculous.
young. Yeah. And I mean, I do understand that there were people who were older than me already in, probably positioned for a promotion or the role, but I don't know. And I remember the day when I asked one of my former managers that I wanted to do the MBA, and I was like, there's some companies who cover 50% of it, which is
Yes.
fantastic because it's bloody expensive. Disclaimer, I'm still doing the MBA and I'm paying for it myself. Um, yeah, and the answer was, why? You're not going to become a manager, are you? So it was like, along those lines. And I was like, "Oh, I'm so over being managed by idiots." So, that was a few years, and I was no longer at Merck, but I had my fair share of idiot managers in my life, or idiot team leaders or whatever. And so at some point I was like, one day I'm going to make my own decisions and manage myself. I don't even want to manage other people because, that's just too much. There's too much
Yes.
stupid in the room
I
sometimes.
agree.
Um and so I was just over it. And my idea was like, I'm going to be 10, 15 years into my life science corporate experience and then become a consultant. Then the pandemic happened and I started freelancing. I was still employed at one of my former companies then, but we all had a lot of time in our hands, and I didn't look for it. I was looked for by one of the expert networks. It's called GLG. They called me up and said, "Seen as you work at Polyplus, yeah, of course. Do you have any liability?" I said, "Of course I can divulge confidential info, but I'm happy to consult on the technology and the market and etc." Um, and so during the pandemic, I probably did, during the first months of lockdown, that was March, April 2020, I've done over 8 to 10 consultations, one-to-one consultations, single blind. So I had no idea who I was speaking to unless they wanted to tell me. And I was like, it's fun. I'm going to do that full time. And so here I am, a few
Do
years
you,
later.
I mean, I guess it's a difficult question to answer because obviously, we all know having a business is lovely, but it's also quite challenging, isn't it?
Yeah.
Any regrets?
No, no regrets. No
Good.
regrets. No regrets in opening my own business. The only regret is probably that I shouldn't have gone into it as naively as I have. But but that's wishful thinking because this is exactly who I am. This
Yeah.
is exactly who I am. It couldn't have gone any other way. So that's why I say it's foolish to regret that, because it wouldn't have been me if if I had done my business plan before opening my business. That wouldn't have been me. I should have, but there's no world this was ever going to happen. So I'm the person who wrote her own business plan 6 months after opening her business. So but that's a whole other story. But
I don't think it matters because I did write mine before and I still didn't have a clue what I was doing for ages.
see,
I'm not sure I still do know what I'm doing.
yeah, some days I do wonder as well.
So I guess the final thing I wanted to ask you is, I mean, I'm going to touch on this again just because I know there are people out there that are in the academic environment doing a PhD that are really struggling with the
Yeah.
toxicity that you described. What is your advice to them if they're in that moment right now?
So I guess the question is it just a toxicity, or is it that you're not getting paid, that you're not being mentored, that you're not learning anything, that you're just burning out? It's, in my case, it was a lot of those things together. And of course, the toxicity was part of it, but I was also not being paid. I didn't have a doctoral contract. They wouldn't help me find another one. So, it was feeling like I was stuck in an infinite loop of being a postgrad student without without the status that goes with being a PhD student. So,
Mm,
and I wasn't getting any mentoring at all. So you're supposed to be mentored during your PhD.
yeah.
And so I know that a lot of PIs, that a lot of researchers that take PhD students do it for the cheap labor. And I know it's still true as of today. that shouldn't be the case, and those people need to be called out. I'm hoping, and at least that's what I'm saying through the people that I follow on LinkedIn, is that maybe there's a little bit more awareness today as to that happening, and so there's probably more channels for students who are feeling isolated and not mentored to go and ask for help. So if you're not getting any help from anywhere, of course you have other options. And if you're not enjoying your PhD, don't feel like you're obliged to finish it. There's a life after that, and there's a life if you don't have doctor attached to your name. I'm probably a testament to that. And again, I'm not saying it's been easy and it's been painless. It's been very painful. I never thought I would get an industry job, and I had no idea that I could. um but if anything, if you can learn anything from this podcast, from myself and from the other guests Martina had on, is that you can. First of all, there's space for you in the industry. um I won't be the first one to tell you you should aim to the managers, to the manager's position, or you should aim really high in terms of salary. I would be, if I had to go back, I would still be very happy with starting end of the ladder, even if I had doctor attached to my name, because you need that experience. That industry is such a different world. But if you feel like you're not thriving in your PhD program or PhD position, if you feel like you have no support, no mentoring, especially if you're not getting paid for your work, then of course look around. I mean, there's space for you anywhere. You don't necessarily need to be a doctor to do it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that we need to, I mean, yes, there are alternatives, but also if you feel like you don't want to do it, it's
Yeah,
fine. It's absolutely fine. Um, it's not the end of the world. There's still a life
yeah,
out there for you.
exactly.
With that, I just want to thank you so much for coming on here, Claudia.
Thank you, Martina,
It's
for having
been,
me.
I mean, just from personal experience, it's been so lovely to hear all about you and your journey and
Thank you.
learn more. And I know that hearing that is going to be so helpful for many listening. So,
I really
really,
hope so.
thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. And to everyone else listening, we will see you again next week with another episode. Thank you.
Bye bye.